Hey guys, Enigmatic Mr. L here, and this is a video where I want to talk about which Fire Emblem games I recommend to start for newcomers. This is a topic that gets brought up here and there, and I wanted to put my own 2 cents in. So I've divided up the games into 5 categories. Recommended, these are the games, as the title states, that I would recommend to people playing Fire Emblem for the first time. I think they're very good introductions to the series. And below that, I have solid runner-ups. One or two flaws somewhat here, but if you don't like either of the games in the recommended, these are certainly fine additions. I think they're, like I said, solid. Then I have mixed feelings, a good mix of pros and cons. Some of the pros might even be stronger than solid runner-ups or recommended. And the cons, they're not a deal breaker, but they are worth noting. So kind of have mixed feelings on those. I got Outclass. Not the worst games in the world to start with, but they don't have as strong positives as the 3 classes above it. The negatives, they are worth, considering. The games in here, I'm sure, people I've started with end up being like fans of the series, but I just think you have better options all around. And then I have Don't, pretty much the games everyone or almost everyone agrees, don't start here. There might be good games in their own right, but you definitely shouldn't start with them. A few rules for getting on the list. I'm not organizing the games within rankings, so recommended just altogether. The games I talk about and say like solid runner-up the game, but the first game mentioned there isn't necessarily more recommended than the last game mentioned in that category. Same for all the categories. I'm not factoring in accessibility for each game. Some of these games, they're very expensive to acquire, and then if you want to go to less savory ways of playing, sometimes it can vary depending on the strength of your PC, that sort of thing. I'm not going to talk about spin-offs, and of course, it's just my personal opinions and preferences. Feel free to disagree. Let me know in the comments below. Many of the things here, it's kind of debatable if it's a solid reason to start with the game or not. Like, if you have a game most people consider the best in the series, should you start with that game? Because on one hand, you would get hooked on the series, but then it could just be followed up with disappointment. Nothing else is as good as that. Or one of the worst games in the series, many people might say, you should start there because then everything after that's going to be improvement. But if you start low, you might not finish that game. You might not stick around with more Fire Emblem games. Same thing with more like, for lack of a better word, accessibility features. Like in newer games to make it like easier to play, especially for newcomers. Some people might say like, you should start with those games, help ease you into the game. But then you get into other games in the series, older games, they don't have that. You might develop bad play styles, bad habits, that sort of thing. It's kind of debatable whether you should start with that or not. So, just take everything with a grain of salt. All right, with that out of the way, let's just get on with the list. Starting with the first game I have in the recommended category, Blazing Blade, otherwise known as Fire Emblem 7, or as it was officially released in the West as just Fire Emblem. It was the first game in the series released in the West. Now, as the first game released here in America, it was developed with that in mind. Has a very extensive tutorial in Lyn mode. Lyn, the assist trophy from Smash Brothers, green-haired sword lady. It says, prepare yourself, and then strikes. She's in this game. That's 10 chapters of that. Really eases you into the mechanics of the game. It's pretty easy in your first time playing. The harder difficulty modes, they're locked behind beating the game like once or even twice. And it's a pretty fan favorite game. A lot of people at least think this is okay. Like, there are definitely people I think who dislike it, but in general, this is a highly recommended game, or game that a lot of people like. The tutorial, it is worth noting, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because some people, especially modern day, find it annoying. They just want to play the game. It goes on for a while. It does that thing where it kind of forces you to take certain actions at certain parts in the tutorial. So that might be turn some people off. They might not want to do it for that reason. The other game I have here and highly recommended is Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, which features Ike. You'll get no sympathy from me. I fight for my friends from Smash Brothers. This is widely considered to be one of the best, if not the best games in the series amongst fans. It has everything you want for good characters, good story, good gameplay, And like Blazing Blade, it's fairly easy. There is a Maniac mode, but that's only the Japanese version. I'm not going to be factoring that into this. Even if you play this game on hard mode, it gives you so many like good characters like Titania, gives you so many resources like bonus experience that it's fairly easy and you still have a fun time. I think both of these games are very representative of what Fire Emblem is, at least most Fire Emblem games. You have a straightforward linear experience from chapter to chapter with a limited amount of gold and experience. So you get a good feel for what most of the games in the series are going to be like, and you're not going to develop like bad habits, that sort of thing. But maybe, your PC isn't powerful enough, or you don't want to go to that less savory origin of doing it that way, but it's too expensive to acquire it like a used copy, and you still don't like the idea of just that extensive tutorial from Blazing Blade. So for that, we had some solid runner-ups. Starting with Binding Blade, my placement here might be a little bit controversial. I'm sure many people would place this much lower, but I think this is a fairly simple game, like Blazing Blade, just GBA mechanics. They're simple. It doesn't have that extensive tutorial, and it features Roy from Smash Bros. Not just an assist trophy, but a playable character. There are a few things to keep in mind here. I think Binding Blade is a game that the more I play it, the more I like it, and kind of starts out a little rocky. There are some things like Roy is infamously just not a very good lord, but there's a certain charm and appeal to that. There are some other issues, though, like ambush spawns, enemy reinforcements that attack on the same turn they spawn. That can be annoying in mini games, but especially Binding Blade. So that is something worth considering. But if you're patient, I think Binding Blade is a fairly recommended one. It is worth noting this game never officially released an English localization, hence the Japan only here. I'm not going to mention drawing too much attention to that in other games moving forward, but it is something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, most people don't have a problem with applying a translation patch or like something like that, but it is worth noting. Another solid runner-up I have is Sacred Stones. It's a very short game. It's easy. It's one of the few Fire Emblem games that doesn't have any sort of connection to other Fire Emblem games, so that might be appealing for some people. Like, it only has 20 chapters plus in-game and like one mandatory guidance chapter. So it's not a big time investment. And it's not like you beat this game and, oh, now you got to play the sequel to it as well. The two main lords, Ephraim and Erica, they don't really have any main story presence in other games. Like, sure, show up in Heroes and everyone shows up in Engage. We'll get to later. But it's kind of a one-and-done deal. That might be appealing to some. Very easy game. Maybe even like you play on quote-unquote difficult mode, just so many units. Seth obviously breaks the game wide open. You get him from like the very beginning. But even beyond that, the reason why I didn't put this in recommended is because of that last point there. It has access to unlimited grinding. And for some people, this might be appealing. They might want to start into it because of that. They can just, characters that are falling behind, they can always go to like the Tower of Olney or skirmishes, level up units falling behind. There's appeal to that, don't get me wrong. I don't think there's any like right or wrong way to play the game. It's just the fact of the matter is that many Fire Emblem games don't have this feature. So if you get into the habit of, grinding up units that fall behind outside of like the main story objective maps, you might be a little bit disappointed when you play other games in the series and they don't have that. So for that reason, that's why it's only in solid runner-up instead of recommended. But still, fun game, and you could do a lot worse if this is your first Fire Emblem game. Next up, I have Fire Emblem Awakening. This is the Fire Emblem game that I started with. I played it back in 2014, like a year after it came out or so. This has Robin, Chrom, and Lucina from Smash Brothers. It has 3 difficulty modes from start: normal, hard, lunatic. Normal mode particularly is very easy, and maybe that's a good thing because you can start off it's your first time playing a Fire Emblem game. You don't want to get too much in challenge. This is set in Marth's world from the future, like thousands of years, 1,000 or thousands of years. They kind of reference the Hero King Marth, like that sort of thing. And it does have a lot of references to past games, but they're not something you need to have prior experience of the Fire Emblem series to understand. Like, you'll find items such as Hector's Axe or Finn's Lance or Micaiah's Pyra or something. And if you haven't played those games, you're not going to understand who those characters are, but you don't need to. You can just know, oh, like I did, it's okay, I got this cool item that I'll use, that sort of thing. This game has casual. It's not the first game to introduce casual mode, but it's the other game that had it. It's not as well known. Casual units in casual mode normally, when a unit dies in Fire Emblem, they're just gone for good. When your player controlled units, your only options are to press on without them, or if you really like the character and you want to keep them, you have to reset the map. Casual mode just means they disappear from that map and they join the next mode. And like access to unlimited grinding, this can be appealing to some. If classic mode, permadeath, it sounds a little too intimidating for you. You want something a little easier. But just bear in mind, the first 11 games in the series do not have casual mode, so that is something to keep in mind. Overall, I think this is Fire Emblem Awakening. When they were making this game, there was a strong possibility that the whole series was going to get axed, so they kind of went all out on it. I think this is a very good game to start with. It's just those last 2 points about access to grinding and casual mode. It might kind of skew your perception of what the series is. And one last point to make about casual mode. This can be discussed for a lot of Fire Emblem games, so I don't want to harp on it too much. But I don't think this is the best game for making the most use out of permadeath. About halfway through the game, you get very few there's only you get very few units in the main chapters, and then in side objectives and paralogs, the units you do get, they're very under-leveled for the time they join. So the game heavily incentivizes resetting if the unit dies, and or grinding up units that you require. So it doesn't make the best use of letting units die be a valid option. Now we're getting into mixed feelings. Kind of some good points, but also some bad points. Starting with Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. This game is kind of Japan only. It did have an official English release, but it was only for a limited time. So thanks, Nintendo. So, as the first game in the series, this is an obvious starting point, and many people would I don't know about many people, but I'm sure at least a few people would insist on be adamant about it. If they're going to start a series, they have to start it from the very first game. It's certainly a valid option. It stars Marth, probably the most iconic Fire Emblem character in Smash Bros. Probably the most iconic Fire Emblem character. The only one who's appeared in every Smash Bros. Game since Melee. The main problem is, as you would expect from an NES game, it just has very slow and clunky and dated user interface. Just NES jank. I think that is a problem that many people could start this game and they just end up not finishing it. Many people who didn't start with this game and they played it after playing some other Fire Emblem games, they end up not finishing it, at least for a good while. They might eventually go back and finish it. So if this is your first Fire Emblem game, there's a chance you might just never finish it and never get into Fire Emblem, period. On the other hand, though, if you do get through this, you play it, you beat it, it's almost exclusively up from there. Other games in series, you can talk about map design or something, but other than the other NES game, the user interface at the very least is much better, and that's a big portion, I think, of just smoothness of gameplay. So a lot of it will be uphill from there if you start with this one. This game did have a remake on the Super Famicom, Mystery of the Emblem. It has the same story as the first game, plus a new book. The old story is called Book 1. This game has a sequel content called Book 2. So you get to experience Marth's full story in one game, still featuring Marth from Smash Brothers. Main problem is this game, I get into it in a little bit, it did get remade again, Shadow Dragon Blade of Light for the DS, just got remade to Shadow Dragon. And either Shadow Dragon Blade of Light for NES or Shadow Dragon for DS, I think, are better options all around. This is just sort of that awkward middle ground where it's yes, it's less clunky and outdated than the NES version, but it's still fairly clunky and outdated. And there is certain charm and appeal to old games, but it doesn't have as much charm, I think, as the NES game. If you're going to play a clunky, janky game, you might as well go all the way and play from the very beginning. There are appeals. Like I said, this is the only way to play all of Marth's story in one game, because when they remade Book 2, they just did it as its own separate game. So there is an appeal to this, but it's just also the fact, like in book one, they had to like cut chapters and characters to make it like fit on the cartridge. It's fine. I think you're better off either playing the NES version or, more recommended, the Shadow Dragon remake. This does change a few things that were arguably for the worse, like stat caps used to be 20 for non-HP stats. That got removed and added in class changing, which kind of many people, including myself, would say takes away a big part of like unit identity, that sort of thing. But I think those are like small sacrifices compared to like just the much smoother user interface. Like you have an actual battle forecast. Okay, if I attack this enemy, I'll have a 70% chance to do 10 damage, 3% chance to crit. They have an 80% chance to do 15 damage, a 0% chance to crit, that sort of thing. Even able to just completely turn off enemy animations and just skip enemy phase altogether. 2 screens for the DS. Much smoother gameplay experience. Still, the problem is, in general, many people, again, myself included, Shadow Dragon, it's not bad per se, but it's just kind of bland. It's generally seen as a weaker entry in the series, which could be a positive. Like I said, you get through this, most of the games are going to be better than this, and many people would agree. But at the same time, you start with this, you might you might not finish it, or even if you do, you might not want to keep playing more Fire Emblem games. And the last game I have here on Mixed Feelings is the most recent mainline entry is Fire Emblem Engage, which has pretty much everyone from Smash Brothers. I mean, Chrom and Robin, they're DLC, but otherwise you do have Marth and Roy and Lynn and Lucina and Corin and Byleth and Ike. They're not from their like original games and storylines. They're kind of here as like spirits or stands or personas or whatever you want to, whatever the closest analogy you can think of them is. But this could be an interesting way to like get the most bang for your buck instead of like getting some knowledge of certain characters outside of Smash Brothers in one game. Like, okay, I play Path of Radiance, know a little bit about Ike. Play Blaze and Blade, learn about Lynn. I'll know a little bit about all of the characters. Not as much as if I played those games individually, but I did see one comment. Someone started this game out looking forward to seeing the heroes from their actual mainline entries. So this game, as you would expect from on entry, has the more like accessibility features like casual mode and access to unlimited grinding. Worth noting, this along with 2 other games have one other feature which I'm just going to call Rewind. It has different names in different games. In this one, it's called the Draconic Time Crystal. In other 2, it's called Divine Pulse or Millis Turn Wheel. But it basically just gives you a limited number of rewinds per map. So if you're playing on classic mode and you accidentally lose a unit, you still have that tension. You want to keep everyone alive, but you're not punished. You don't have to restart the whole map. You can just rewind and rework your strategy. There's a nice like middling ground. Just worth noting, currently only 3 main series games have that, so don't get used to it. Weapons don't break in Fire Engage, which is something somewhat unique to the series. A few games have this. I personally prefer to like just having a weapon durability. I think that's a big part of Fire Emblem. Along with weapon rank, it's what makes it so it's like, okay, I have this iron sword with 40 uses and the silver 20 uses. The fact that your better, more expensive weapons can break has more incentive not necessarily to hoard them, not just to spam them willy-nilly. So that is worth something considering here in terms of like what to expect from the rest of the series. And it's also worth noting the general consensus of Fire Emblem Engage is the gameplay's good, the story not so much. So if you're someone who really wants intriguing characters and story, this might not be the best game for you. All right, now we're getting into games that are outclassed, which I said at the beginning of this that these might not necessarily be bad per se. I just think every game mentioned beforehand would be a better starting point. Starting with Genealogy of the Holy War, according, I think, to an interview with Shozo Kaga, the creator of Fire Emblem, this game is set in the same universe as like Marth's timeline. It just takes like place like thousands of years prior to that. So that could be an incentive reason to a good incentive to start. Kind of enticing. To start here, then play Marth. But it doesn't really make much explicit reference to anything. It's kind of just like, according to one comment, Shozo Kaga, this game take place in the same universe, and there's not much in the games itself to suggest that. Main thing just going against this is just it has many unique mechanics that would give you a skewed perception of what Fire Emblem is. Like, you need a skill to double, or like this is called Pursuit in this game, follow up. Most games don't have that. You need a skill to crit, or like a weapon with at least 50 kills on it. Each unit has their own gold, as opposed to just one big like stock of gold for the entire army. I think this is the only game which doesn't have just like open trading mechanics. You have to use like the pawn shop. So it's just little things like that. I think you have better options all around. Next, I have Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. This is an interesting one because in theory and on paper, it looks like it'd be very good for newcomers. It stars Corrin from Super Smash Brothers. It's a fairly easy game. It's mostly unique setting, so you don't really need to have prior experience. It's kind of hard to put my finger on it. Maybe it's the fact like weapons don't break. That is one factor. In this game, I think it's even worse than Engage. Like just the way they implement weapons in this game, the stronger weapons have like downsides, like penalty to speed and skill. That many of them they're not even worth using. But in general, many people who started with Birthright, they end up just not finishing or getting bored and moving on to something else. I think this is a game that you're better off just playing after you've at least played Fire Emblem Awakening. There are 3 characters in Fire Emblem Fates that are kind of like XPs or like references to characters in Awakening, and 3 characters that are straight up just from Fire Emblem Awakening. I think at the very least you should play Awakening before you play Fates. Also worth noting, this game has Fire Emblem Fates has a unique mode called Phoenix Mode. In this mode, characters just die. Your characters who get killed, they instantly resurrect on the next turn. Could be useful if you just want to like grind for supports or something, or enjoy the game's stories. But in general, none of the Fates games are known for having good stories, so that is worth noting. Also, I Fire Emblem Conquest on here. Just same thing with Birthright. I don't think this is the best game to start with, maybe for different reasons. Map design is generally considered a lot tighter and better compared to Birthright, but it's also a much more difficult game. So you're better off just having experience with at least a few Fire Emblem games before getting into Conquest. Just kind of ease into that. And this one might be a little surprising. Fire Emblem Echo Shadows of Valentia. I know I've seen some people think this is a good game to start, and like it's not the worst idea in the world. It's just it has some mechanics that pretty much only show up here. You have the usual weapons don't break, but in this case, you really only have one weapon inventory slot per character, or like an item, like a heal item or something. Which pretty much every other game you have like at least 4 or 5. You can hold 4 or 5 like weapons or items at a time, so that's just kind of very different. This also has like dungeon crawling, which doesn't really show up elsewhere. It's set in Marth's world, but it's on a different continent. And if you play this game, you'll understand the basic story and characters. You're not going to be lost, but there are like a few references I don't think you fully appreciate it unless you've played like Shadow Dragon, maybe like Shadow Dragon or Shadow Dragon: The Blade of Light. Like there's these Pegasus Knight sisters who show up in this game that are also from there, which you'll appreciate more if you played that game first. There's a character named Zeke here, which you'll know a bit more about his background if you played Marth's game first. So it's just small little things that I think is the outclass. Plus, it has the usual thing of like rewind, casual mode, and grinding, which might develop bad habits. Now we have Fire Emblem Three Houses, featuring Byleth from Smash Brothers. Normal and hard modes, both pretty easy. If you play in normal mode, you have access to unlimited grinding. On hard mode and maddening, but this is your first Fire Emblem game, first time playing, you're not going to be playing maddening, or at least you shouldn't. If you play on hard mode or maddening, access to grinding is limited. It has a lot of unique mechanics compared to other games in the series, excluding a few gender-locked classes or like Lord-specific classes, Lords plus Byleth. Every character can be any class, and every class can use every weapon type, excluding magic. Only certain classes can use magic. So that can just set up a disconnect for what you expect from the rest of the series. Many people got into Fire Emblem through Three Houses, and then they were disappointed with Fire Emblem Engage because it didn't have as strong like writing and characters. Even though on average, Engage is probably more similar to previous Fire Emblem games. Just, standard ROM, collect the MacGuffin, slay the evil dragon. Doesn't have the moral complexity of this game, so it kind of sets your standards, I think, the wrong way. Also, if you want to explore like all three routes plus the secret fourth route, it's a big time sink. I probably don't recommend it unless you're like a major Fire Emblem fan like me. Otherwise, you're probably better off just playing one route and then just wondering what would have happened if you had chosen another one. And finally, we have the just don't category. I'm not going to spend too long talking about these games. They might have some positives, which will be on screen, but for the most part, I'm just going to discuss the reason why they're in this category. I really do not recommend any of these games. Starting with Fire Emblem Gaiden. It's a clanky, janky NES game. If you're going to play something like that and you're dead set on it, you might as well start with the first game in the series. And even then, you'll have access to like more iconic Marth as opposed to like Alm Celica. Or if you're just dead set on exploring the world of Valencia, this game is just made obsolete by the remake. Like I mentioned, Shadow Dragon changed some things that were arguably not for the better in the original. And while you could say that's true of Echo Shadows of Valencia, I think it's a much more faithful remake. So either just, if you're dead set on doing something like this, either just play Shadow Dragon Blade of Light or Echo Shadows of Valencia. Next, we have Thracia 776. This game is a midquel to Genealogy of the Holy War, and as such, starting this game spoils like major plot twists from Genealogy of the Holy War. And even if you don't care about like story, characters, that sort of thing, this is a very difficult game. Maybe not difficult in terms of like enemy stats are high, like that sort of thing, but it is difficult. Things it just expects of the player to do, like certain Gaiden chapter unlockments, character recruitments, or just general gameplay mechanics. This is very difficult. Would not recommend this as your first time. At least play a few Fire Emblem games for it, including Genealogy of the Holy War before you get to this one. Radiant Dawn, similar to Thracia 776. It's best played after Path of Radiance. And maybe if this is just your second Fire Emblem game, the first one, Path of Radiance, that could work. It's a direct sequel, so if you play Radiant Dawn, it kind of reintroduces plot points. You could probably get by and understand enough, but you won't fully appreciate certain characters, like returning, that sort of thing. And Radiant Dawn is a fairly difficult game. Not like Thracia 776, where it's like expects obscure things, although maybe a little bit of that. More so just enemy stats. This game, there's kind of I don't know if you'd call it translation error, but it's like in Japan, the difficulty modes were labeled normal, hard, and maniac. And then in the North American version, they changed it to easy, normal, hard. So many people played normal, expecting normal mode, but they're actually playing hard mode. So difficult game, and play Path of Radiance first. New Mystery of the Emblem, sequel to Shadow Dragon. So you're better off playing that game first. It does kind of just reintroduce characters, and you can understand what's going on, but you don't fully appreciate like certain aspects of it unless you've played that game first. And finally, we have Fire Emblem Fates Revelations, which has all the problems of Birthright and Conquest, just as like you're probably better off at least playing Awakening so you can understand like certain characters. But just on top of that, the game's story is recommended to play after Birthright and Conquest. If you try to choose this route, it flat out tells you this, like play Birthright Conquest first. And many people consider this to be the worst game in the series. So if you play this, you might not stick around for Fire Emblem as a whole. And that's my complete list. As you can see, just a quick recap. I have Path of Radiant, or Blazing Blade and Path of Radiance recommended. Binding Blade, Sacred Stones, and Awakening, and solid runner-ups. Shadow Dragon and Blade of Light, Mystery of the Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and Engage, and Mixed Feelings. Then Outclassed, we have Genealogy of the Holy War, Birthright, Conquest, Echoes, Shadows of Valencia, and Three Houses. And then finally, just don't, is Gaiden, Thracia 776, Radiant Dawn, New Mystery of the Emblem, and Revelation, plus the spin-offs, which I'm not talking about those. All right, thank you so much for watching. Questions, comments, rude or snidey remarks, please leave them in the comments below. And this is Enigmatic Mr. L signing out.